Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So today, the lovely people at Arrtx actually sent me their 48 color acrylic marker set. So this is kind of what the box looks like. This is their 3mm version of their acrylic markers. So right on the back side, you can see the color selection. So not only do they have the 48 color set, they also come in a 36 color set. So if you wish to have a smaller set, definitely check out the 36 color set instead. I believe all 36 of the colors are in the 48 color set. So if you do want one that has a little bit more of like blues, greens, and extra red or so forth, then check out the 48 color set, which is what we are going to be looking mainly today. So right upon opening the box, you are greeted with the wonderful look at the markers as well as some spare extra nibs. So you can kind of tell from the nibs, they're kind of like a blunt end, kind of similar to like a bullet nib, where it's not really like a brush tip or a chisel tip. It's kind of just like a rounded end of a marker. So both sets, their boxes do come with little holes or like little places for your markers to sit in, so they don't really like get jumbled up, which makes organization very easy. I'm going to show you guys a quick look at the marker itself. So this is kind of what it looks like before you actually activate the paint inside. Let's go ahead and grab one of my sketchbooks that I like to use for my color swatches, and this is actually where I keep some previous sets from before. Like here's the 36 marker set. I have some of their other acrylic marker sets that have the brush tips, which are also very fun to use. So I've already done a swatch previously of the 36 color set earlier, so let's go ahead and swatch our 48 color set. So as the marker states, to activate the pen, shake the marker to mix the ink, then press the tip several times. Start the marker once the tip is inked. So I'm going to go ahead and start to shake the marker, trying to get the metal ball in the inside to activate the paint and make sure it's like flowing and all nicely mixed together. After that, I'm going to press down the nib and it's going to retract a little bit to kind of like pump out our paint. So while doing this, be a bit wary. Some markers I found flowed the paint very quickly, and some other ones floated a little bit and needed a little bit more encouragement. So one of them, like I think the white one, only took one press and the paint immediately came out. So it was kind of nice that these markers are all very nice and juicy. None of the paints were dried up from my knowledge. But we are going to go ahead and do all of our color swatches now. I am going to switch over to a better view so that the glare isn't so in your face. Now, for the most part, every marker pretty much activated all the same. We can start from like white, silver, or gold. So we do have like 2 metallic colors and there are 2 fluorescent colors as well. And as I'm swatching, I am using kind of like my left side page to activate the markers. I'll show you the aftermath a little bit later, but for the most part, these markers activate super quickly, super easily. I found that none of them were dried up, and the little ball inside, when you shake it, mixes up the paint quite nicely. I will show you a bit of a few examples of if you don't shake the pen enough, your paint might not be mixed thoroughly, so there will be some color separation, which might not show the true color of the marker exactly. You might have a little bit of streaking, or the color is going to be kind of like separated into like a thin color and like a thicker, darker color, which is kind of not what you really want. At the end here, you can kind of see that when I was doing the fluorescent colors, I was trying to show you guys the barrel a little bit because I'm sure the formula for the fluorescent colors are a little bit different. They probably took the longest to activate, and I mean longest, I mean just like maybe a second or 2 more, because the ball inside the marker just needed to move around a little bit more. You could feel like it was getting a little bit stuck, but it wasn't a problem. And here is kind of our overview of our color swatches for all 48 colors, and you can see that they're quite opaque, and I think they dry fairly matte. Now, while I'm writing out the little kind of like title for our swatch sheet, you can see that I did not really mix the marker well enough, so you can see that it's darker on the top, and as we start to write a little bit more, it kind of evens out a little bit, which is kind of what I meant, where there's a little bit of color separation. So make sure to shake it before activating, or to like when you're using your marker if you want like an even application. So from previous experiences from using like acrylic markers on other surfaces such as like paper, glass, like etc. I found that using these linen canvases that I gotten from Paul Rubens in the past worked out the best for me, as they do have kind of like pre-primed painted surfaces and they're very easy for me to use, so I don't really have to worry about like, you know, prepping a canvas per se. So I went ahead and sketched out Shu Yamino because I wanted to make a gift for my friend. Now I already kind of like pre-planned a few of my colors right off the bat, and I did not take my advice at the very beginning and I did not shake my marker prior to using it. So right now it's coming out very liquidy and almost like yellowy rather than more of like a peach color. So please remember to shake your markers, activate it on a separate piece of paper just to make sure the ink is flowing, or not the ink, the paint is flowing, so that you can kind of get a more consistent and even application. I also find that if your marker is well mixed, the dry time is going to be fairly even among all your markers. But if you don't really mix them, it becomes a little bit more like watery and thin, and it takes quite a while for it to dry. So just be wary of it when you're using the markers. So to start off, I ended up drawing Shu using the palette color Eno red pencil on top of this linen canvas or panel, I guess. And then I went ahead and started to block in most of like the skin tones for Shu's face as well as his hands, and would kind of block in more of like a cell shady way, as that's kind of like my preferred way of using these paint markers. I know some people like to blend or mix. You can use your fingers to help blend things out if you want to and treat it more like acrylic paint, but for me, I do like how opaque they look, so I like making them appear more like, I guess, like cell shaded look, similar to like anime stills or something like that, where the edges of colors are a little bit more harsh. So I wanted to go for that look for both of the illustrations for today. But talking a little bit more about the drawing, the reason why I'm drawing Shu... Oh, wait, actually, when I was applying the second layer, I once again did not shake it as thoroughly for this particular paint marker. So once again, it was a little bit more watery until I shook it properly. And when I was applying the paint to his ears, it was much more even, as well as the paint dried more faster. So you can see the areas near his forehead and under the hair is kind of drying very slow, while the paint already on his nose, his lips, his kind of ear sections are already dried. So yeah, just make sure to shake that marker, but just be careful when you're shaking it, because I did have one marker that kind of leaked while shaking. I don't know the reason for that, but it did happen. So just be a little bit careful when using the markers, just like any other paint markers out there. I'm sure that if you accidentally not put the cap on correctly and then shake the marker, you're gonna have a bit of an explosion of paint all over your desk. But back to Shu. So I wanted to do a quick painting of Shu because I wanted to include some kind of drawing as a gift to my friend, as I'm going to be sending out her package pretty soon, and her favorite VTuber from Nijisan GEN is Shu Yamino, so I wanted to draw that for her as a small gift. And I am doing his like third outfit, which is his casual cafe cozy kind of wintry autumn look, and I thought it'd be fun to do him because also the colors in his color palette are kind of fun, so I thought it'd be fun to use them for our paint markers and kind of play around with our color selection to see how I want to interpret some of the sections. So for the most part, coloring everything was pretty easy as long as I was kind of conscious of where I'm laying down certain colors so I could let certain areas dry and then work on different sections to start layering. So initially I ended up doing Shu's hair kind of like with black, but then I switched quickly to brown so that I could easily layer up my shadows rather than layering up my midtones, just because that's how my brain works. It was easier for me to kind of shade in the normal way, but because these paints are super opaque, you can actually layer up your lighter colors on top of your darker colors with no problem. But I'm most familiar using like stuff like watercolor or graphite or colored pencils when you tend to build up your lighter colors first into your darks rather than building up your darks and then pulling out your midtones and your highlights afterwards. But this piece gave me a lot of time to really work out how I wanted to use these paint markers before we work on the larger piece a little bit later. So most of the footage is going to be in time lapse just because I wanted to show you guys pretty much me filling up all the areas kind of all together together, so you can kind of see the piece come together all at once rather than in snippets. And you can kind of see like the dry time, see how I approach certain areas when I'm doing the layering for the hair and all that. If you watched like previous videos where I've used paint markers, I definitely think these might be my favorite paint markers to use if I want to block out large areas super quickly. It also becomes quite even looking, and there's a lot of paint to dispense, so I don't really feel too pressured about being maybe wary of things drying up or running out of paint anytime soon, because it has so much paint already in the barrel and the coverage is great, so you don't really have to do too many passes over and over again. But I definitely think you can use these alongside with the other paint markers maybe you have, or from Arrtx. They have like many different sets that have like full-on chunky large chisel nibs to ones that have more of a felt tip kind of brush tip, as well as another one that's more akin to an actual brush where you can get your finer lines, which in this case, when I was working on shoe, I purely only used the 3mm markers because I wanted to see how thin of lines could we get if we wanted to do outlines, which I'm doing right now, or if you wanted to do some bigger flat areas like I did for his hair, the background, his scarf, and all that. But for the most part, you could do the entirety of your drawing with just these markers. But if you want to have an easier time, accompanying with some of the other sets that they have, I think will make stuff a little bit more easier for you to do if you want to do like thinner details, or if you know you want to block out some super large areas, then looking at their larger kind of like flat chisel tip markers are a good idea as well. So I don't know if you can tell, I've been trying to avoid Shu's eyes for quite a while because I don't really want to accidentally give him too thick of lines for his eyes, because those are going to draw a lot of attention. But I had a lot of fun just adding highlights and different colors alongside with being able to go back and forth with some of the colors and layering them up. So in his mouth, I ended up making the kind of like inside of his mouth more dark red rather than the lighter pink that I initially had. But now I'm waiting for it to dry so I can layer it up the pink again, letting that dry, and then eventually letting the white kind of go back to fill in his teeth again. But I had a lot of fun just like adding a bunch of details here and there with different colors, because I don't usually work in this cell shady kind of style with traditional mediums. I'm often like the type of person who really likes to either lightly layer things up to build up like value and color, or I like to work a little bit more softly where you're starting to blend everything. Working with like kind of a cell shaded, more opaque medium that allows you to layer up and just have very bold colors, it just makes it fun to have a different kind of style towards your art. So this one was just very fun to do, as well as a good test for the next piece that we want to do soon. Also, just because this linen board has like a canvas texture, there are some places where the markers did skip a little bit just because of the texture of the canvas. I'm sure if you use like a completely smooth surface, you won't have any of these issues. And also just the accuracy of me going back and forth, I might miss some areas anyways. But here's kind of what he looks like, and we're moving on to our next piece. So moving up to a significantly larger linen panel, I'll pull out Shu so that you can kind of see the size difference. It's about, I think, doubled in size for the most part. You can kind of see with my hands as reference how big this particular panel is, but kind of like the similar format, I decided to sketch out Mualani this time from Genshin Impact with the Pilot Color Ino and the color red. And then we're going to take our skin tone kind of color for Mualani and start to block out everything. Now I am being a little bit more cautious when it comes to coloring with paint markers, just because it is an opaque medium. I won't be able to see my sketch all the way through every step of the way. So I'm making sure that while I'm blocking out certain areas, I'm leaving enough room for my brain to know if there's supposed to be lines here or if there's supposed to be a different object. So trying to make sure these areas are kind of like crisp and clean so that I don't get lost once we do end up coloring in all of my sketch lines in the very end. Also, Mulaney's hair is kind of like on the lighter side. I believe she kind of has more like white hair with like blue accents here and there, and like the shadows, you could do more of a cooler color to kind of let it fit into her color palette and color scheme a little bit easier. Or you can say it's kind of like a very, very, very light pale blue. So for the most part, her hair is not going to be fully colored in with the paint marker. I kind of let the linen canvas have those whites pop out. There are some areas that I ended up doing kind of like a little bit of a flat of white, just because there's some sketch lines I would like to cover up, and these markers obviously do the job quite well and cover up those sketch lines quite easily because of how opaque they are. So I'm constantly referring to my swatch sheet to make sure that the colors I'm using are going to match what I want them to be. I tested out some colors on her right shoulder, or like on the right side of the canvas, and they were a little bit too light, but I found a nice color that works for the shadows for Mualani skin tone, and hopefully it kind of works out because, like I mentioned, unless you're like doing a bunch of blending or you're very confident with how you want to use like your layering capabilities, you could probably mess around and play around with like a bunch of rainbow colors for everything. But because it takes me a long time to kind of like warm up to a medium, that I play it very safe at the very beginning. So for the most part, while I'm working on Mualani, I'm trying my best to make sure that I don't kind of run into some potholes here and there in terms of how I want to approach this particular piece. But later on, I think I get a little bit more, I guess, like having fun with the medium, where I'm just testing out colors, and if they don't work, we can cover it up. Or if I want to test out a different color, I'll just layer on top and just see how it looks. But right now I'm just kind of like blocking in very much just like flat colors. I don't really do any blending, and if there is any blending that you see, it's mostly by accident because I end up putting a color when it's still wet, I guess like next to another color that's still wet. So it's kind of like me being a little bit impatient here and there. But I definitely think this is probably like my go-to for paint markers, probably as of recently, just because of the coverage being so opaque, as well as like the amount of paint that it dispenses is just like the perfect amount. I definitely think some of the other ones that are for like finer details, or that ones that you have a little bit more control, sometimes they feel like they dispense a little bit less ink, so the coverage might be a little bit more spotty. Obviously, this is going to depend also on the surface that you are applying your paint markers to, which is why I do like the kind of linen canvas kind of panel that I'm using, because it does just have a normal kind of prime surface that's already perfect for acrylic painting. I do have one more kind of panel that's a lot larger. I think it's probably 0.5 larger than this one, so it's not like super big, but it is a little bit more like a horizontal version of this particular canvas, which I would like to do another go at using these markers. And maybe I'll throw in some of my other markers, like acrylic markers from the Arrtx series, because I feel like they work all well together, and maybe do like a more ambitious piece where we can do like a full background and do a little bit more of like layering and maybe some blending, just to kind of test it out a little bit more. Even though like this piece, compared to the one that I did for my friend of shoe, I definitely like this one a lot more. I don't know if it's because it seems a little bit more crisp and I feel like I knew what I was doing at this point, instead of the one where I did of shoe was a little bit of me finagling and kind of like testing out the medium. But I think this one turned out pretty cute though, and the colors, even at this stage, or like the way how I kind of applied them, being like with the flats and stuff, it just reads very well and very opaque, and I really like it. I think it would be fun to do those types of pieces where you paint on glass and then you flip it over and you can have like a full kind of like an anime still on like a piece of glass or a piece of acetate or something like that, and you can keep it kind of as a little piece you can put on your desk. I think that's really cute, and it's like also very convenient, I guess, to have it as a piece rather than like something like a super large canvas like this, because I don't know where to put this one particularly, but maybe I can go with the one I did of Tea like a long time ago. So that's like a little reminder to myself that I should pick up acrylic painting again, maybe in the future, maybe not, we'll see. So unlike the one that I did of shoe, for the most part, I'm doing all of my flats and my shadings and my highlights all with the 3mm paint markers this time, but later on you're going to see that I'm going to pull out a different set to do the line work, just because I wanted everything to be super crisp and clean, and the control on the 3mm, at least for myself, is a little bit varied. But before I get to that, I did end up using my Kneaded Eraser to erase some areas because, like I mentioned, there were some areas that I wanted to cover with the paint marker to cover up my sketch lines, but some areas I could just erase easily off this board, and then we can do line art afterwards and not have to worry about the sketch lines being in the way. But while I was using these particular 3mm markers, I did notice that if you use it on its side or if you use it like directly upright, you are going to get a little bit of variation in your lines. So it's not like it doesn't have line width variation, but because of that, I can't guarantee my line art being very consistent when I'm working with it. So this is why I'm going to be opting to use different markers afterwards so that we can do the line work and I can get a little bit more control, as I'm more used to using kind of like a brush tip or like a brush like object or medium, I guess, if that makes sense. So for Mualani, we're kind of like in the final stages of blocking in the colors. Like I mentioned, I mostly block from light to dark first, but some areas like the ribbon on the back of her head, I ended up doing the flat of the darker blue, and then for the highlights, I pulled out the lighter blue. It's just some things I find easier for me to understand, and then some other things I find it easier to do the opposite. So yeah, for the most part, blocking in was very easy and very fun because, like I said, the markers are very opaque. So I didn't have to do like several passes for the most part for most of the areas. But now with the flats basically being done, let's go ahead and do our line work. So I had free colors from the Simptap markers of the Arrtx brand's paint markers. So I decided that I would just probably go with the darker blue instead, but unfortunately, it's not the darker blue that I ended up showing in the very beginning. It's kind of more of like a dark ultramarine color. The one that I showed at the very beginning alongside with the brown. One, the brown was a little bit too light. Two, the light kind of the other blue that I ended up showing, it was kind of more of like a mustier, not mustier, I guess like a dusty turquoise grayish blue, which I did not think it really matched with Mualani's color palette. So the blue that I ended up choosing, it kind of looks black at the very beginning, probably because of the lighting and the contrast with the other colors, but it's kind of more of like a dark purple when it's against the rest of these lighter colors and blues. But for the most part, it's kind of like, yeah, like a dark ultramarine, slightly leaning more towards purple, but I thought it'd be a little bit softer but had enough contrast compared to the black. I think black would have stood out a little bit too much and I would have been a little bit too wary, but the dark purple kind of fits a little bit better with her color palette in my opinion, and it had enough contrast from the rest of the colors that I could use it to really add more value to certain areas. So in the gloves where there's like darker blues, I ended up shading it a little bit more so that they read a little bit closer to like a blue black instead of just like a plain mid-tone blue. And then other areas where there are lighter colors, I can play around with the line width or just like the line art, I guess in this case, and just like make sure to add a little bit of detail to create depth or like any of that, just to make sure that things don't read too flat. But I did like having the contrast to be kind of evident just because her color palette and the kind of the background of the canvas are going to blend in a little bit too much because of her hair color. But you can kind of see the difference between using the Simptap markers versus using the 3mm markers. 3mm has like very good control and very good consistency and very reliable. The Simptap, if you're not as, I guess, like good at controlling your lines, you might struggle a little bit with getting thinner lines. Obviously, the lines that I'm doing for the line art are going to vary. Sometimes I used a little bit too much pressure, sometimes not enough. But for the most part, the brush tip from the Simptap markers give you a little bit more versatility with having the kind of like flexible brush tip instead. But I do like using the 3mm for like majority of the coloring. I just wouldn't really use them for outlining unless I'm doing like a very large piece where maybe I can do more of like an upright position with the marker and get like a very consistent thickness for all the lines all at once. But for some smaller details, it's a little bit harder for me to use. Let's say for like little hair strands or like little highlights, I guess, like I was doing in Shu's hair. They became very uniform, if anything. But here's kind of like the look of what Mualani looked like at the very end. I think she turned out super cute. I love her color so much. She's one of my favorite characters from the Natlin characters of Genshin Impact. And here's the comparison of her with Shu. Kind of the size and like the color application feels a little bit different in terms of like the line art kind of tying everything together. So one final step I kind of forgot, because this one doesn't really have a background color. I wanted to take out my kneaded eraser and kind of go over the entirety of the canvas so that I could get rid of any of the sketch lines that were not covered by any of the paint markers, including like the 3mm and the brush tip from the Simptap markers. And it just makes everything look like it has a cleaner look. And I don't know, I really like this one. So maybe if I have time, maybe I'll do like a live stream or like a longer form video for you guys where I'm using the markers, and maybe we can do the other two and do Kachina and Kinich, because I think that would be cute to have them all matching. But I think that's it for today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me use the paint markers today. If you're interested in any of the paint markers, I'll list them in the description and please check them out. But thank you again to Arrtx for sending me these paint markers for me to try out. I always have a blast using and experimenting with their acrylic paint markers, as it's a medium I'm not super familiar with all that much. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching today's video of me drawing Shu Yamino and Mualani from Genshin Impact, and I will talk to you guys in the next video, and hopefully it won't be too long till I do another session with acrylic paint markers again in the future. So I'll talk to you guys next time, and see ya! Bye!